Today, we're breaking down the Kangchenjunga climb, where these Sherpas already knew these men were going to die. Bound by pride and loyalty to each other, these two men convinced themselves that accepting aid meant weakness and dismissed any help their Sherpas gave them. The decisions that followed were so devastating that it would haunt the entire mountain. It was May 6, 2016, and Kangchenjunga Base Camp sat at 16,900 feet on a desolate shelf of glacial moraine in northeastern Nepal. No helicopter traffic, no tea house trail. The nearest road was over a week of walking through valleys that saw more yaks than people, and the mountain, the third highest on Earth at 28,169 feet, rose above camp in a massive wall of fluted ice and dark rock. 5 expeditions occupied base camp that spring, totaling roughly 35 climbers. Kangchenjunga's fatality to summit ratio was among the worst of any 8,000er. If something went wrong above Camp 4, help was not coming. Among the climbers preparing for the spring window were Derek Hollis and Grant Mercer. Derek was 47, from Denver, Colorado, a former Army officer who had spent 20 years in service before transitioning into private security consulting. He carried himself with the controlled physicality that military training embeds permanently. Economical movements, constant spatial awareness, a habit of scanning terrain before stepping onto it. His mountaineering resume included a guided Everest summit in 2014 and a guided Manaslu summit the following year. He had paid $85,000 for the expedition and treated the investment the way he treated operational budgets, as a commitment that demanded returns. Grant was 43, from Scottsdale, Arizona, Derek's friend from their years in the Army and now his business partner in their security consulting firm. He was stockier, quieter, and carried himself a half step behind Derek in every interaction, not out of weakness, but out of a habit built over 2 decades of letting Derek lead and following without hesitation. His only 8,000er was the same 2014 Everest climb, where he had summited alongside Derek under heavy Sherpa support. He had not climbed above 20,000 feet since. His presence on Kangchenjunga was motivated less by personal ambition than by the fact that Derek was going, and neither of them had ever been the one to sit something out. Their dynamic was visible from the first evening at base camp. During the expedition leader's initial briefing, covering the route through 4 camps, acclimatization schedule, and objective hazards, Derek asked detailed, tactical questions about timing, weather margins, and contingency plans. Grant sat beside him and said almost nothing, occasionally nodding when Derek made a point. When the expedition leader emphasized that Sherpa judgment on summit day was final and non-negotiable, Derek responded that he respected expertise, but expected to be consulted on decisions affecting his climb. Grant agreed without adding anything of his own. At meals, Derek dominated conversation with mission planning language, calling the summit push and objective, referring to camps as positions, describing acclimatization as conditioning for the operational phase. Grant echoed the framework without challenging it. The two functioned as a closed unit, reinforcing each other's assessments and leaving little room for outside input. The expedition leader assigned his 2 most experienced Sherpas to the pair. Furbathendu was 41, from the village of Tame in the Khumbu, with 15 years of high-altitude guiding behind him. His record included 6 Everest summits and 1 previous Kangchenjunga summit in 2013. He was quiet in the way that experienced mountain workers often become, economical with words, preferring to observe before speaking, and letting decisions communicate what conversation could not. He was known for conservative turnaround calls that occasionally frustrated clients, but had never resulted in a fatality on his watch. His income supported a wife and 4 children, with much of it directed toward his youngest daughter's schooling in Kathmandu. Kancha Galzin was 34, from the Rolwaling Valley, with 10 years of guiding experience. His resume included 4 Everest summits and strong technical skills on mixed terrain, but this was his first Kangchenjunga expedition. He was physically powerful, capable of carrying heavy loads at altitude with a steadiness that impressed even veteran Sherpas, but he tended toward deference with clients in ways that sometimes cost him leverage when disagreements arose. He supported elderly parents and sent money monthly to a younger brother studying in Kathmandu. Sherpa was assigned to Derek. Concha was assigned to Grant. Both Sherpas assessed their clients within the first days and arrived at similar conclusions. Derek was fit and disciplined, but approached the mountain as a problem to be solved through planning and willpower, qualities that became dangerous above 26,000 feet, where the body deteriorated on its own timeline regardless of preparation. Grant was capable but clearly dependent on Derek's judgment, which meant any decision Derek made automatically became Grant's decision. Two clients who validated each other's choices faster than any outside voice could intervene meant that turning one around required turning both, and turning both required breaking a bond neither man would willingly surrender. Sherpa raised this concern with the expedition leader on May 8th. Two clients functioning as a single decision-making unit created a problem that individual Sherpa guidance could not easily solve. The expedition leader acknowledged the concern but pointed out that both men had signed liability waivers, paid in full, and demonstrated baseline competence. Unless they showed clear medical incapacity, the expedition would proceed. He told Sherpa and Concha to monitor closely and report any deterioration immediately. The first acclimatization rotation began on May 9th, climbing from base camp to Camp 1 at approximately 20,000 feet through steep snow slopes and rocky traverses that gained 3,500 feet over several hours. Derek moved efficiently, his fitness evident in his rhythm, though Sherpa noted his breathing was heavier than expected for someone of his conditioning. His oxygen saturation at Camp 1 measured 76%, acceptable, but lower than predicted given his physical baseline. Grant labored more visibly. His pace slowed on steeper sections. His rest breaks grew longer. His saturation read 73%. Concha asked about his hydration and sleep. Grant replied that he felt strong and attributed any fatigue to the early adjustment period. Derek, overhearing, added that Grant always started slow and finished strong, a pattern from their military days that he presented as evidence rather than hope. The second rotation pushed to Camp 2 at roughly 21,800 feet 2 days later. The route steepened and narrowed, with fixed ropes guiding climbers across exposed snow faces. Derek showed signs of strain, longer pauses, a tightness in his breathing that hadn't been present lower down. His saturation at Camp 2 read 73%, a drop that suggested acclimatization was progressing slowly. Grant developed a persistent cough during the climb. It started as a dry hack he attributed to cold, thin air. By the time they reached camp, the cough had deepened, producing small amounts of clear mucus. Concha asked directly whether the cough was producing anything colored or bloody, a question designed to screen for early pulmonary edema. Grant said no and dismissed the symptom. Derek backed him immediately, telling Concha that altitude coughs were normal and Grant had dealt with worse. The conversation ended not because Concha was satisfied, but because both clients had closed the discussion. The cough was likely irritation from dry air, but its progression and the mucus production at only 21,800 feet warranted attention. If it worsened higher up, it could indicate fluid accumulation, a precursor to pulmonary edema that could become life-threatening within hours. Sherpa agreed and said he would raise both clients' conditions with the expedition leader when they returned to base camp. The third rotation reached Camp 3 at approximately 24,000 feet on May 13th, and the problems became harder to dismiss. The route involved sustained climbing on fixed ropes across ice faces angled between 40 and 50 degrees. Derek's pace dropped noticeably, stopping every 40 to 50 feet, breathing audible from several body lengths away. At Camp 3, his saturation read 69%. Grant was worse. His cough had become constant and productive, each spasm bending him forward on the fixed line while climbers waited below. The mucus carried a faint pink tinge that Concha observed when Grant spat into the snow, a sign that capillaries in his lungs were leaking under altitude pressure. His saturation measured 66%. His crampon placements were imprecise, and twice during the ascent he stumbled on terrain that required nothing more than steady walking. When Concha asked how he was feeling, Grant glanced at Derek before answering. Derek nodded slightly. Grant said he was fine. Both Sherpas brought their observations to the expedition leader via radio that evening. Declining saturations, physical deterioration, and in Grant's case, a cough consistent with early pulmonary edema. Sherpa recommended both clients descend to base camp for extended rest and reassessment. The expedition leader radioed Derek directly. Derek responded that oxygen saturations at 24,000 feet were expected to be low, that both he and Grant had experienced similar symptoms on Everest without incident, and that their bodies would continue adapting during the rest period. The team descended to base camp on May 14th. Over the next 3 days, Derek appeared to recover partially. Saturation stabilized in the mid-80s. Grant's recovery was less convincing. His cough persisted. He moved slowly around camp and spent long hours in his tent. When other climbers asked how he was feeling, he responded with the same answer, ready to go, saving energy for the push. On May 16th, forecasts confirmed a narrow weather window beginning May 18th. Approximately 36 hours of reduced wind and clear skies above 26,000 feet. The expedition leader gathered his team for the final briefing. He reviewed the route from Camp 4, the turnaround time of 1 p.m. regardless of position, the oxygen plan, and the necessity of descending before the window closed. He looked at Derek and Grant specifically when he stated that Sherpa judgment on summit day was the final word. Sherpa made one more attempt that evening. He sat with Derek outside the mess tent as the temperature dropped and explained that Kangchenjunga was not Everest. The route above Camp 4 was more technical, more exposed, and far more remote. Rescue above 26,000 feet was effectively impossible. Derek listened without interrupting. Then he explained that he and Grant had trained for 18 months, that the expedition represented a significant investment, and that the weather window might be the only viable opportunity of the season. He did not dismiss Sherpa's concerns. He simply placed them alongside other factors and concluded the balance favored continuing. When Sherpa asked whether Grant shared that assessment independently, Derek paused for the first time in the conversation, then said that Grant made his own decisions. The summit push departed base camp on May 16th, moving upward through established camps over 3 days. Grant's cough returned above 21,000 feet and deepened steadily. By Camp 3 on the evening of May 17th, he was coughing in sustained fits that left him breathless and hunched. His saturation measured 64%. Derek's read 67, better than Grant's but below what experienced guides considered safe for continuing higher. Concha told Grant directly at Camp 3 that the cough and numbers indicated his lungs were filling with fluid. Without descent, the edema could progress to a point where breathing became impossible. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Camp 4 sat at approximately 26,200 feet on a narrow shelf exposed to wind from 3 directions. The team arrived on the afternoon of May 18th as the weather window held. Sherpa checked both clients one final time. Derek's saturation with supplemental oxygen at 2 liters per minute read 65%. Grant's read 61% with the same flow. Grant's breathing between coughing fits carried a faint crackle. Fluid had accumulated enough to be heard in normal respiration. Sherpa told both men plainly that Grant's condition was consistent with pulmonary edema and that continuing upward would likely result in complete respiratory failure above 27,000 feet. Derek acknowledged the risk. He stated that supplemental oxygen at higher flow rates could manage symptoms long enough to summit and descend. He was not asking Sherpa to guarantee safety. He was asking Sherpa to support the climb they had all agreed to undertake. Grant, sitting beside him, coughed twice and said he had climbed through worse. The summit push began at 10:15 p.m. under clear skies, sharp with stars. The temperature with wind chill sat near minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The route above Camp 4 followed a rising ridge that alternated between steep snow and rocky mixed ground, with fixed ropes marking the line through the most exposed sections. Sherpa climbed ahead of Derek, setting the pace and checking anchors. Concha climbed behind Grant, close enough to intervene if he stumbled. For the first 2 hours, both clients moved steadily. Derek maintained a slow but consistent rhythm, His breathing labored but controlled through the oxygen mask. Grant followed at a slightly reduced pace. The mountain was quiet in the way that extreme altitude imposes. No conversation, no sound beyond wind, breathing, and the crunch of crampons on hard snow. The deterioration began around 27,000 feet, roughly 3 hours into the climb. Grant's cough shifted from periodic bursts to near continuous spasms that forced him to stop every few minutes. Between fits, Grant's breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest working visibly through layers of down. His pace dropped to 15 steps between stops, then 10, then fewer. Derek continued climbing ahead with Sherpa, pausing only when the gap between himself and Grant grew large enough that the rope team's cohesion broke. At 27,400 feet, Kancha moved up to Derek and told him Grant needed to descend immediately. The cough was producing pink sputum again. His saturation had dropped to 57% despite supplemental flow, and his coordination was degrading. Turning around now gave them the best chance of getting him down alive. Derek said Grant would rally. He always did, and they were continuing. He turned and started climbing. Sherpa stopped him. He stepped into Derek's path and repeated what Kancha had said, adding that Derek's own condition was marginal. Decisions made above 27,000 feet by oxygen-deprived brains were not reliable. The pattern he was watching, two clients reinforcing each other's determination while their bodies collapsed, was exactly the scenario that produced fatalities on 8,000ers. Derek stepped around Sherpa and continued climbing. Grant followed. What remained was the choice between abandoning two men to die alone or accompanying them deeper into a situation almost certain to end badly. They continued climbing. Above 27,800 feet, Grant collapsed. His legs folded beneath him, and he dropped onto the fixed line, hanging from his harness with his full weight. The coughing continued but produced no audible breath between spasms. His lungs had filled to the point where oxygen exchange was critically impaired. When Kancha reached him and tried to help him sit upright, Grant's eyes were open but unfocused, his hands making no effort to grip the rope. Derek was 40 feet above. Sherpa told him to stop. Derek turned, saw Grant hanging on the rope, and descended immediately. He grabbed Grant's harness and tried to pull him upright, adjusting the oxygen mask, trying to force Grant's legs under him. The effort was frantic but accomplished nothing. Grant was past the point of the voluntary response. What happened next consumed the remaining margin. Derek refused to leave Grant. He crouched beside him, his own breathing deteriorating as effort and emotion accelerated his oxygen consumption. Sherpa and Kancha worked to position Grant for descent, shortening tethers, checking anchors, preparing to lower him down the ridge. Every minute at 27,800 feet moved all four of them closer to the line between rescue and addition to the body count. The descent began around 4 a.m. with Sherpa leading, Kancha managing Grant's weight from behind, and Derek climbing between them. Grant was dead weight, his body limp, head rolling with each movement. Lowering him required Kancha to brace against the slope and feed rope, while Sherpa guided direction from below. Grant stopped breathing at approximately 27,400 feet. Kancha felt the change through the rope, a slackening when the small involuntary movements of a living body ceased. Sherpa climbed back to check. Grant's eyes were partially open. Pulmonary edema had progressed to complete respiratory failure. At that altitude, resuscitation was impossible. Grant Mercer was dead. Derek was 10 feet above when Kancha relayed the information. Hypoxia and shock had converged, and his brain was no longer assembling thoughts in order. Sherpa told Derek they were descending now, that Grant was gone, and they needed to move. Derek did not resist but did not cooperate. He moved when guided, stopped when not actively directed, and required physical prompting to clip and unclip from anchors. By 5:30 a.m., the wind had turned severe, gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour, spindrift reducing visibility to feet. Sherpa and Kancha were now managing a single incapacitated client on steep, exposed terrain in conditions that would have been dangerous without a casualty. Derek's legs had begun failing, buckling unpredictably, catching crampon points on rock. On a steep traverse near 27,000 feet, Derek's legs gave out completely. His full weight dropped onto Kancha, who was braced below on the fixed line. The sudden load wrenched Concha's lower back, a sharp electric pain that shot down both legs. He held the rope. He did not fall, but something in his spine had shifted in a way that sent pain through every subsequent movement. Sherpa took over primary support, pulling Derek forward and downward, while Concha followed with deteriorating mobility. Derek Hollis lost consciousness at approximately 26,500 feet and did not regain it. Sherpa and Concha continued lowering him for another hour. Sherpa's outer gloves stripped away during the technical work of managing ropes and harness on the traverse. The cold entered his fingers gradually, then completely, sensation disappearing in a progression that began with numbness and ended with the hard, wooden stiffness that signaled tissue death. Derek's breathing stopped at approximately 26,300 feet, less than 200 vertical feet above Camp 4. Sherpa checked and found no pulse. He and Concha sat in the snow beside the body for several minutes, unable to continue and unable to process what had happened. Then they descended the final stretch to Camp 4 on autopilot, arriving as other teams were beginning their own summit preparations. Both deaths were confirmed by radio to base camp that morning. The expedition leader coordinated with other teams to document the locations of both bodies. Neither was recovered. On Kangchenjunga, above 26,000 feet, body recovery was effectively impossible, and both men remained on the mountain. Sherpa Thendu was evacuated from base camp 4 days later when the full extent of his frostbite became apparent. He lost 3 fingers on his left hand and 2 on his right, damage that ended any possibility of high-altitude guiding. He returned to Tem and used savings and a small compensation payment to open a supply shop serving trekkers on the route to Everest Base Camp. Concha Gyaltsen completed the descent under his own power, but the back injury sustained while catching Derek's weight proved permanent. Herniated discs and nerve damage produced chronic pain that no treatment fully resolved, and doctors advised that carrying loads at altitude risked paralysis. He returned to Roll Walling and did not take another guiding contract. The season continued around the loss. Other teams summited during the same window. The mountain, as it always does, said nothing. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.